What is popping YouTube? Bringing you the running back week 15 tier rankings for you. Starting it off here in the S tier, and we have none other than CMC. I could put some other running backs in this tier, make it 6 like we do with the wide receivers, but there's no reason to put anyone else besides CMC here. If you have CMC, you're in the playoffs most likely. You're absolutely killing it. CMC versus Arizona, A++ matchup for my man CMC. Then we move here into our A tier, and we got Alvin Kamara, Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson, Tony Pollard, Rachaad White, Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler, Jahmyr Gibbs. Starting it off here with Alvin Kamara versus the New York Giants. It's an A+ matchup. Alvin Kamara is the PPR monster. Doesn't matter if Derek Carr is there. Doesn't matter if it's Jameis Winston, Chris Olave streaking down the field. Whew. Alvin Kamara. We were hoping that this would be what was going to happen when you had to wait those 3 games. People were telling you to wait for him. You were drafting him in the 6th, 7th round. Alvin Kamara's absolutely showed out being that late round drafted running back. So this week I have him as an RB2 in the first week of the playoffs. Absolutely love it here for Alvin Kamara. Then moving on to Kyren Williams. Ever since Kyren Williams has come back from this injury, it has been uber impressive when we talk about him. 38, 20, 14 fantasy points. Now, last week versus Baltimore wasn't maybe the best that he's performed, but let's be clear. The Baltimore defense has been absolutely astounding. Putting up 14 fantasy points against Baltimore still feels good. This week, it is against the Washington Commanders, which is probably going to be the best matchup Kyren Williams has over the whole entire playoff. So if I have Kyren Williams, I'm absolutely firing him up this week as my RB3. Then we move on to the next guy in this list, and it's going to be Bijan Robinson, Mr. Bijan. And last week, the Falcons, we saw what a competent Falcons offense could look like with Kyle Pitts getting involved, Drake London having a career day, and even Bijan Robinson with 20 fantasy points here, finishing as the RB9. And the thing is, they were going up against Tampa Bay, but down the stretch, the Atlanta Falcons have some really good matchups here with the Carolina Panthers here in week 15 and in week 16, the Indianapolis Colts. But we are talking about week 15. So Bijan Robinson versus the Carolina Panthers. If he gets the 10 attempts, 7 targets, and 5 receptions that he had this last week, I think we could be talking about Bijan Robinson having himself a good day. If he gets a few more carries than even what he had this last week, I think Bijan Robinson, like we said, right here as my RB4 in the A tier, feels absolutely great. Then we move on to Tony Pollard. And yes, Tony Pollard, it's been a slow stretch onto the year. But when we look at what happened this last week, 17 fantasy points, 17 fantasy points, 22 fantasy points, 18 fantasy points. He is on the verge of having just an absolute massive day where he's getting over 20 fantasy points. So I absolutely love some Tony Pollard as they go up against the Buffalo Bills. This Cowboys offense has been absolutely humming. So go get some Tony Pollard, stuff him into your lineups. Next guy on this list is going to be Rachaad White. Rachaad White for Tampa Bay, been the PPR light, the Alvin Kamara-esque, where he put up 22 fantasy points this last week, put him as the RB7. The week before had 20 fantasy points, put him as the RB10. And the thing is, Carolina and Atlanta, the last 2 games, this week is going up against the Green Bay Packers. It's an absolute great matchup for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's supposed to be around 35 to 37 degrees as they're playing at Green Bay, so it's not going to be a super cold Green Bay day. So I like some Rachaad White. Feels like a great matchup for him. Next guy is going to be Saquon Barkley. And Saquon Barkley, if you watch the Monday Night Football game, he could have had a lot more fantasy points. I know he fumbled. That might have cost some of you guys, but he did have some electric runs. And this week going up against New Orleans, and New Orleans defense has been really good. But the volume for me with Saquon is what makes me super excited about Saquon. Where this last week, 20 rushing attempts for 86 yards, 4 targets for 3 receptions, and 2 total touchdowns. Now, he did only put up 23 fantasy points with 2 touchdowns. You hoped it would be more in the 25 range. But I still like the volume that Saquon's getting. Tommy DeVito doesn't look incompetent like some Saquon Barkley. Then we move on to Austin Eckler here. Austin Eckler had been super disappointing up until this point where he was finishing in the RB30s. But last week versus Denver, finished as an RB8 with 21 fantasy points. And you guys were all telling me, Caleb, can't be starting Austin Eckler like this. Kind of risky. Well, I think he proved that floor that he does have. 10 rushing attempts for 51 yards, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and 1 total touchdown with the backup quarterback this week. Austin Eckler is going to have to get used. It's an okay matchup. And rounding out this A tier, we got Jahmyr Gibbs. And yes, Jahmyr Gibbs has re-jumped David Montgomery in my rankings. Finished as the RB15 last week with 17 fantasy points in PPR. I think the most exciting part about Jahmyr Gibbs is just his overall volume. We're hoping that he gets some more receptions out of the backfield. But like we said, going up against Denver, they have given up a ton of fantasy points to running backs. It's hard really right now for me to put David Montgomery ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs in any facet because Jahmyr Gibbs is getting more volume and even getting some of that touchdown workload. Moving on to our B tier, we got Zach Moss, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall, Derrick Henry, Raheem Mostert, David Montgomery, Devon, and DeAndre Swift. Starting it off with Zach Moss. And yes, Zach Moss probably did a lot of you dirty this last week where he only put up 10 fantasy points as the RB29. And a lot of you are going to be saying, Caleb, why am I going to re-roll the dice with Zach Moss? I mean, 13 rushing attempts for 28 yards, 8 8 targets for 4 receptions. I mean, this target share that he continues to get, 8 targets this last week, 3 the week before. He does have that full workload capability here for Zach Moss. So I hear you. Maybe I do have him too high. Maybe I should have put Travis Etienne above Zach Moss, but I still like Zach Moss. We saw what he was able to do earlier this season when Jonathan Taylor was hurt. So start Zach Moss with confidence again this week. I'm rolling him out in a bunch of lineups. So if he burns us again, whatever. But he's got the upside, and that's what I'm shooting for here in the playoffs. Then we move on to Travis Etienne, who finished as the RB14 last week with 17 fantasy points. Trevor Lawrence is back, so there's no need to worry about him. But this week, it is the matchup for me with Travis Etienne. That's why I have him here in the B tier, going up against the Baltimore Ravens. We literally just saw what the Baltimore Ravens did to Kyren Williams this last week. So we do have Travis Etienne here in our B tier. Moving on to Breece Hall, who had himself a really great day this last week. Probably got some of you guys into the playoffs with that RB2 finish with 27 fantasy points. Going up this week, though, against Miami, who has been pretty advantageous against the run. Now, the Miami Dolphins are probably going to beat up pretty heavily on the Jets. And so they might have to get out of this rushing attempt game where they're not able to get the volume for Breece Hall. But even last week, 9 targets is what Breece Hall got, 8 receptions for 86 yards, 1 total touchdown. So if he's able to continue getting those catches out of the backfield, absolutely love some Breece Hall here. Next guy in our rankings is going to be Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry with Will Levis, DeAndre Hopkins really emerging. 17 carries, 34 yards, 2 total touchdowns, 1 reception for 17 yards. This is my thing. 18 fantasy points. Finished as the RB11. I like Derrick Henry's schedule down the stretch. We got Houston this week, Seattle next week. I like these next 2 weeks for Derrick Henry, so we will keep him here in our B tier. Then we move on to Raheem Mostert. And Raheem Mostert, I don't know what's happening with Devon. I have these guys both in the same tier, but it was Raheem Mostert's day, finishing as the RB5 with 23 fantasy points in week 14. So for me, I still think Devon has more upside than Raheem, but like, what can you do when Raheem's getting all the volume? Like 21 rushing attempts for 96 yards, 1 target, 2 total touchdowns for Raheem with 23 fantasy points. Now, when we look at Devon, what happened this last week, 7 rushing attempts for 47 yards, 9 targets, 5 receptions. Now, maybe if he houses one of those, we are having a little bit different day talking about Devon. But for me, I have both of these guys in this tier. I still have Raheem Mostert ahead of Devon, but I still think both are definitely going to be startable. And then we got David Montgomery, who we kind of already talked about with Jahmyr Gibbs. Great matchup versus Denver. David Montgomery really hasn't finished in the top 10 running backs since week 5. And so that overall high-end upside, I just feel like is not there. They're not giving him the same amount of goal line carries earlier in the year. And it just kind of feels like touchdown or bust for David Montgomery. So Denver, it is a good matchup. But like we said, we like Jahmyr Gibbs a little bit more in this matchup than we do with David Montgomery. And rounding this tier out with DeAndre Swift, I hear you. It's been absolutely atrocious with DeAndre Swift. RB31, RB37, RB52 finishes the last few weeks. So he arguably is not even startable, but the only thing that is pulling us in to having DeAndre Swift here in our B tier is the fact that he is on the Eagles. So we like this matchup versus Seattle. He is still the lead back. I know he's been getting less carries every week, but we still like some DeAndre Swift here. Moving on to our C tier, we got Javonte, Kenneth Walker, Zeke, Josh Jacobs, James Cook, Jerome Ford, Najee Harris. Starting off here with Javonte, we do like the matchup with Javonte at Detroit. They're going to be throwing him the ball. He's been getting plenty of volume, looking very, very healthy. Put up 18 fantasy points this last week. So go start Javonte with confidence. Then we got Kenneth Walker, and I hear him coming off of that injury, only put up 9 fantasy points, was the RB31 in PPR. I still like Kenneth Walker. I still think that explosion is going to be there. Like high-end RB2 is where we're at right now with him. I understand if you aren't excited to start Kenneth Walker, but you're still starting him. Any healthy running back you're starting and throwing in your lineup at this point. Then we move on to our next guy, and that's going to be Zeke Elliott. Finished as the overall RB1 with 27 fantasy points. Shout out to Zeke against Pittsburgh. It was a very bad matchup for him, but this week goes up against Kansas City, and he is probably going to be the only offense that the Patriots have in this backfield, in this whole entire offense. So start Zeke. It's crazy to say, but it's that time of year where these guys start to emerge, where we haven't talked about them all season, and then boom, Zeke is in our C tier. Then we got Josh Jacobs here. Finished as an RB5 in week 12, but then had the bye. Then finished as RB42 with only 13 rushing attempts for 34 yards. Had 0 touchdowns, 7 fantasy points. For me, this Raiders offense just is bad. It's not really supporting Davante Adams or really not supporting Josh Jacobs, but the talent is there. So that's what gets him into this tier. I just don't know what that volume is going to look like versus the Chargers. Then we got James Cook versus Dallas. It's a must-win game for the Buffalo Bills. The thing that excites me about James Cook, finished as the RB3 this last week. He's getting the targets, 5 targets, 7 targets, 4 targets the last few games. And so like we said, if he can get 2 to 3 catches a game, plus with that rushing volume, James Cook is going to be pretty valuable. Jerome Ford had himself quite the nice day with Joe Flacco in the backfield. And yes, I hear you. Jerome Ford, the Cleveland Browns, they're fighting for their playoff lives. Going up against Chicago is a really great matchup for him. Finished with 13 fantasy points, 14 fantasy points, 12 fantasy points. He's just super consistent, so you definitely need to be starting Jerome Ford in your flex spot if you need to. And rounding out this tier, we got Najee Harris going up against Indy. Indy has been pretty susceptible to the run. Now, it hasn't been great for Najee Harris. Last week only had 8 points. The week before that had 10. The week before that had 16. But I do think this is a Najee Harris type touchdown upside game here versus the Colts. And then rounding out our running back tiers, we got Jalen Warren, Chuba Hubbard, James Conner, Brian Robinson, Devin Singletary, Joe Mixon, Alexander Madison, Jack Charbonnet, AJ Dillon. Kind of same thing with Jalen Warren. We like Jalen Warren, have him back-to-back here with Najee Harris. Chuba Hubbard, we like the matchup. He has been pretty productive when he's been on the field. Have him here versus Atlanta as a top 24 running back. Then we got James Conner. And James Conner, it's sad going up against San Francisco. It's a terrible matchup, but he does get sort of the volume. So I do have him here. What's going to happen with this Arizona Cardinals offense this week, we shall see. Brian Robinson, it's kind of been hit or miss here as of recently with him. Finished as the RB32, RB34. Hasn't been since week 11 where he finished inside the top 10. So Brian Robinson, maybe this is the week where he gets some touchdown upside, but this offense seems to be stumbling a little bit in the rushing attack for the Commanders. And then Singletary, will CJ Stroud play? That's a big factor of having him here, but you also still have some Dameon Pierce snipping at the heels. Joe Mixon versus Minnesota. Now, this one might be a little low. I'll be completely clear if you're watching this, if you're already in the comments and you are commenting that Caleb, he's a little low. He's finished as the RB1, RB6 the last 2 weeks. I don't know what the heck you're talking about. No, I made these rankings and I might be talking myself out of it here in the comments. The thing is, I really think the Minnesota Vikings defense is really tough against the run. And so for me, it's a little bit of the matchup base with Joe Mixon. But like I said, if he's getting 19, 21 carries like he's gotten the last 2 weeks, I'm easily going to get dunked on for this take. So hear me out. We might be moving up Joe Mixon to our C tier. But like I said, I'm recording this on Tuesday night. So I still like Joe Mixon, but have him here in our D tier. Then we have Alexander Madison. It's a volume base for Alexander Madison versus Vikings. Then we got Zach Charbonnet and AJ Dillon to round out the D tier. So let me know down below. Ask me any start sit question. Let me know if I have the Joe Mixon take wrong. I want to hear your thoughts as well because we're trying to help you win this week in the playoffs. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you're new, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.